Hi guys, and welcome back to another spooky Saturday. Today's video is probably going to be on the longer side because I watched this Netflix documentary, which is the inspiration for this video, by the way. It's called Girl in the Picture, and it was really compelling stuff. It was really just honestly an insane story. So I felt like I had to cover it because it was just so crazy. But I will say, trigger warning up front, it is also one of the most brutal stories I've ever heard in my entire life. So if you have any sort of trauma around R-word or SA, or if you or someone you deeply care about was a victim of child abuse and it's a sensitive subject for you, you might just want to skip this one, and that's totally fine. I'll see you on Monday for like a lighter subject where we'll do a mukbang. It'll be totally fine. Just want to put that out there up front. In order to tell this story correctly, we have to go back to the 1980s. I want to say that Marshall was a normal high school girl, but that really wouldn't give her credit where it's due. She was one of those kids who often had the note exceeds expectations on all of their work. She was in ROTC, she was in science club, she was in the gifted and talented program, and rightfully so. So she had a lot going on at school on top of her normal workload. Beyond that, she was considered beautiful. When she first started at her school, all of the guys turned their heads. All of her friends said that every single guy in the school was like, "Who's that?" So you would assume because of that that she was running with the popular crowd, but that wasn't really Sharon's personality type. She loved an underdog. She was known for being this incredibly empathetic and socially intelligent girl. If she saw that a kid was being bullied, she would always go out of her way to uplift that person. She was really just a gentle soul in that way, really compassionate, and honestly, from what I could tell, nobody had any negative experiences with her in high school whatsoever. She was friends with all of the dorks, all of the nerds. She mainly hung out with the kids from the gifted and talented program who self-identified as like outcasts at the time. But really, she was loved by all. Now, you don't tend to overachieve without some sort of goal in mind, right? Her goal was that she wanted to be an aerospace engineer, and she wanted to go to Georgia Tech. That had been her goal since she started high school, and she had been methodically working towards it. So senior year, she sends in her applications. She's telling everybody, I'm gonna go to Georgia Tech. I'm gonna be an aerospace engineer. But she exceeds expectations once again. Not only does she get into Georgia Tech, and not only does she get into their aerospace engineering program, but she's given a full scholarship. She couldn't wait to tell her friends at school. She went around to all of them, especially her best friend Jenny, and she was like, I did it. I got into the Georgia Tech aerospace engineering program. Everybody was like, yeah, no surprises there. And then she just sort of was like, all right, I'll call you. We'll talk about it more, but like, make sure you don't call me, remember? And all of her friends were like, yeah, of course. We know the rules. Sharon's best friend Jenny could tell you, her dad was strict, but on top of that, other parents didn't seem to really like him. He was kind of weird. He committed a lot of social faux pas. For example, the first time that Sharon went over to Jenny's house and their parents met, Warren, Sharon's dad, asked Jenny's dad for a loan. That's a ballsy move even with people that you know closely, let alone with somebody who you're meeting for the very first time. So of course Jenny's father was like, no, what? No, you can't work. No, we're not giving you a loan. And from that moment forward, it always left a bad taste in his mouth. And he told Jenny, listen, Sharon is a great girl. She's really nice. She's beautiful. She's a great student. I think she's a wonderful influence on you. Her dad, however, atrocious vibes. I don't ever want you sleeping over at that man's house. You can go over there, you can see Jenny, you know, during daytime, but you are forbidden from ever sleeping over at Sharon's house, you understand? Jenny's mom, she thought that he was being a little bit harsh, that like, yeah, Warren's a weirdo, clearly, but Sharon shouldn't be suffering just because her dad's strange. I mean, obviously she turned out just fine, but having a weird dad wasn't the only roadblock in young Sharon's life. For example, in first grade, her mom had actually died. She was on a pedestrian bridge when she had been sideswiped by a car, killing her. So Sharon had grown up with only Warren for support. So even though Warren is clearly weird, he's a single dad, and Sharon turned out to be one of the most beloved students in her high school community, on top of being a massive academic success and getting a full ride scholarship. So the parents thought to themselves, you know, he's got to be doing something right. Maybe we just don't get him. Maybe we just don't see it. The loan thing wasn't Warren's only red flag though. At the end of the year, the parents get to submit pictures of their kids throughout their life for the yearbook so long as they're graduating seniors. And most of the other parents, I know my parents did this as well, they submitted cute or silly baby pictures. Warren didn't do that. Warren submitted what a lot of the other parents felt was a sexy picture of Sharon for her school yearbook. Jenny especially, she felt uncomfortable with this. She looked at it and she just thought, why would a dad take a picture like that of his daughter? It's just kind of weird. Meanwhile, some of the more open-minded parents were like, you know what? It might be a little bit more of like a edgy photo, I guess, but she does look beautiful in it, and maybe he's just proud of what a beautiful young lady his daughter is. But Jenny was more wary. Despite her father's rule that she was never allowed to sleep over, Jenny's mom, when her father was out of town, had given her an exception to the rule. She said, you know what? You can go ahead, you girls have been great. Go ahead, sleep over at Sharon's house. I know you want to. You've been asking for years. Your father always says no. Just don't tell dad that I'm letting you do it, okay? Our little secret. I'm not like other moms. I'm a cool mom. And they go over to Sharon's house and they're doing classic girl stuff. Sharon and Jenny are going through all of her things. She's showing her all her stuff. And then it comes to a point where she shows her a new bra that she's gotten. And Jenny's like, whoa. That's like a very sexy bra. Like, think like Victoria's Secret bombshell bra, you know? And this is like the 80s, so Jenny was like, where did you get that? And then Sharon opens up her bra and underwear drawer, and it's just full to the brim with lingerie. And Jenny's like, okay, whoa, like this is a lot. Like, where did you get this? And then Sharon explains like, oh, you know, daddy just bought it for me. And then Jenny sort of like side eyes her like, what? That's like a weird purchase for a dad, Sharon. Like, that's like, dads don't usually do that. If anything, they like want you to stay their little girl, which is weird too, but not as weird as this. Sharon explains like, oh, well, you know, like it's just because they're beautiful and my daddy's proud of me. He thinks that I'm beautiful, so he just wants me to have these beautiful things. Like, it's fine. The girls are standing in the room looking in this lingerie drawer, and they were in the middle of changing. So they're in their bra and underwear too, when suddenly Warren busts into the room. He has a gun, he's waving it around, and he points it in Jenny's face. Jenny is frozen. She doesn't know what to do. So she just doesn't do anything. And Sharon looks at Jenny and she says, it's fine, Daddy's just being silly. He's just in a silly mood. Like, he does this all the time. Don't worry about it. Warren's yelling at the girls, and then he eventually storms out of the room. Jenny is in shock. She does not know what to think. Sharon is looking at her and she's like, hey, it's okay. Like, it's fine. Like, he does this all the time. Just don't worry about it. And so then the girls start getting ready for bed. Jenny sets up her sleeping bag on the floor, and then Warren busts back in the room again, still holding the gun. He points the gun at Jenny and he tells her to get into her sleeping bag and put her pillow over her face. And then he gets on the bed with Sharon and he assaults her at gunpoint. Sharon turns to Jenny and she says, hey, I'm okay. You're okay, we're okay. Daddy's just like that. Let it go. And Jenny, not knowing what to do, feels like she has to be a good friend to Sharon after what she just witnessed, and that the only thing Sharon asked her to do was to do nothing. So Jenny doesn't tell anyone. And as time passes, the more she thinks about it, the more she thinks, you know what? Sharon is gonna be okay. She's compartmentalizing this. She's gonna be okay. She's going to go to college and she's gonna be an aerospace engineer, and she'll have some distance from Warren, and she'll be able to do whatever she needs to do. Because Warren was so strict with Sharon, she would always tell her friends, hey, don't call me at home. Let me call you, okay? And if they were on the phone with her and her dad came home, she would always rush to hang up. Like, okay, I gotta go. And hang up super suddenly. And they knew not to call back. One day, Sharon calls Jenny, and Jenny picks up, thinking it's a normal phone call, and she tells her she's pregnant. Jenny does not know what to do. She's in shock. She asks Sharon, like, what are you gonna do? Do you know? And Sharon says, yeah, I'm gonna have it and I'm gonna give it up for adoption. Daddy won't let me keep it. And then Jenny's just listening. She's trying to be a supportive friend, but this is like a lot to take in. when Sharon follows up with, Daddy also says, I can't go to college anymore. And Sharon goes, wait, what? No, like, you have to go, because, you know, she's counting on the fact that, like, this is the only way she can get away from Warren. And it's something that she's been working towards for years. It's her dream. She deserves to go. Sharon just says, well, Daddy says someone's got to stay back to take care of him. And I'm the only one who can. Let's jump forward to April 1990. It's late at night in Oklahoma City, and there's 3 men driving in a truck. As they're driving down the road, they think that they see some debris on the side of the road, so they pull over to investigate. Maybe there's something of value there, maybe it's hazardous and it needs to be moved out of the way. Either way, they're pulling over. As they get out of the car, they see some personal belongings, some trash, and then a body of a white woman with blonde hair. Upon further inspection, it's not a body at all. It's someone who's still alive. So they call EMS and they report immediately. They take this woman to the hospital and she is entered into the ICU stat. She's identified as Tanya Hughes, and her husband Clarence shows up in a panic, super concerned. He explains to nurses, that's my wife. We have a young child named Michael. He's only 2 years old. And you would be panicking too if you found that your wife, who was a pedestrian, had just been hit by a motorized vehicle and left. Tanya's husband was much older than she was. It was a huge age gap relationship, and the way that he was interacting with the staff, they just felt really uncomfortable around him. So they start talking to Clarence more and they get some more information from him. He tells them that Tanya is a stripper and she works for the Passions strip club in Tulsa. This is later confirmed by Karen Parsley, who was Tanya's best friend and also co-worker at the club. Clarence had called her to let her know what had happened to Tanya. She didn't even know that they were going out of town. So this was really shocking to her. She wanted to visit Tanya. Clarence was like, I don't think you're allowed to visit the ICU since you're not family, but Karen did not care. She showed up, she drove down, and she was gonna see Tanya no matter what anybody did about it. They were new friends, but good friends. They had known each other for about a year at this point and had quickly become best friends. Tanya had introduced her to Clarence early on and baby Michael, and Karen just loved getting to see Tanya interact with her son. She was like, she's such a great mom, and like you can tell how much she just loves Michael and how much Michael loves her. She actually loved hanging out with them together so much that she would make suggestions all the time like, hey, we should take Michael to the zoo together. That'd be so fun. I bet he would love that. You know, I know he's only 2, but still, animals. And then Tanya would have to politely decline like, oh yeah, I'm not really allowed to like take Michael to places without Clarence, you know, and like he can't come because he's got work, so we can't really go. And at first Karen was like, oh, okay, maybe not the way that I would parent, but who am I to judge? And then over the course of the year, Karen started to notice more and more bruises on Tanya. They were getting increasingly worse, significantly more severe, and she knew, even though Tanya would constantly deny it, say that she tripped, that she fell, that this happened, that that happened, oh, there was an accident, blah, blah, blah. It was obvious to Karen that Clarence was the one behind these bruises. And because it was so obvious that Karen was not buying what Tanya was selling, it made it so that they could talk about things a little bit more openly once Tanya got a little bit more comfortable. And Tanya even told her, you know, Clarence actually just took out a life insurance policy on me, and it's kind of making me nervous. Like, I don't know, I'm kind of scared, and he always has Michael with him. I want to run away, but like, I can't. I'm not running away without my son. I'm not leaving my son. And she just felt like she was trapped and she had no way out. It was obvious to Karen that Clarence was weaponizing baby Michael, that he knew he didn't have to follow his wife around. He didn't have to keep her under lock and key so long as he kept baby Michael on a tight leash. So on April 25th, when Clarence called Karen and told her about Tanya's accident and told her, oh, I don't know if you can come into the ICU, alarm bells were immediately going off, and that's why she insisted on coming. She knew that the situation was weird on a whole host of levels, but the first red flag that really jumped out to Karen was the fact that she didn't know they're going out of town. There was no way at this point in their friendship that Tanya would go out of town with Clarence and baby Michael and not tell Karen. It just didn't make sense. She knew it was all off. When Karen got there, the nurses pulled her aside and they said that they suspected foul play. They explained that the injuries on Tanya's body were not consistent with somebody who had been hit by a motorized vehicle. In fact, she would be in much worse shape if she had been. Her vitals were actually pretty stable at this point in time. She had a medium severe closed head wound, and that's what got her into the ICU. They were treating her with intravenous fluids, they were treating her with medicines to stop her brain from swelling, and they were controlling her blood pressure. So at this point, they had a really good handle on Tanya. So that's not the only person they were worried about. They were also worried about baby Michael, and they started asking Karen about his condition. Karen was like, his condition, what do you mean? And the nurses were like, oh, well, he's a nonverbal child. We were just wondering what it is that he's been diagnosed with. And Karen was like, no, baby Michael's not nonverbal. And the nurses were surprised to hear that because the entire time that Clarence had been in the ICU with baby Michael hadn't made any noise. He hadn't talked at all. And that is a real red flag for child abuse. After talking with the nurses, Karen knows she's got to do more to help get Tanya out of this situation. She's thinking maybe because these nurses can attest to potential foul play, we can help get Tanya custody. Then suddenly she gets the call. The hospital informs her that even though when she had left, Tanya's vitals were really stable, she had suddenly just absolutely downturned and had passed. After hearing this news, Karen knew that she had to inform Tanya's family because frankly, she didn't trust Clarence to do that, especially if he had something to do with this. So she went in the phone book, she found Tanya's mom, and she called her. She said, hi, I'm Tanya's best friend. I'm so sorry. Like, I have some terrible news to tell you. And she told her what had happened, only to get a response that she could not have possibly predicted. Tanya's mom says, you know, Karen, I really appreciate that you're calling me to tell me this. You seem like a nice person, but my daughter died 20 years ago when she was 18 months old. I don't know who you're talking about. Karen thought for a moment like maybe she had the wrong number. Maybe this wasn't Tanya's mom. But the more she went over and over and over again, she was certain this was the woman who Tanya had alleged was her mother. None of it made sense. And so when it came time to actually bury Tanya, Karen, not feeling sure of her identity anymore, didn't want to put a last name. She didn't want to give her Clarence's last name. She didn't want to give her this woman's last name, who allegedly is not her mother. So her tombstone just read Tanya. After all of this, upon the hospital's instruction, Karen calls DHS and Michael is placed into the foster care system. Michael's foster parents, Merle and Ernest Bean, who are lovely people, by the way. They seem so genuinely sweet. Ernest could not be a more appropriate name for the dad. Oh my goodness, but they get baby Michael just a day after Tanya's passing. They're located in Choctaw, Oklahoma, so they were nearby. They already had fostered several other kids, and when they got baby Michael, they were instructed, you know, he is still being bottle fed and he drinks Pepsi. That's about it. So like, okay, they get him, they're bottle feeding him, they give him a Pepsi because that's what they were told to do, and he's just in this incredibly emotionally volatile state. And they know, all right, we're gonna eventually have to wean him off this bottle. We're definitely gonna have to wean him off Pepsi because a 2-year-old just shouldn't be drinking Pepsi like this. And so Merle is like, you know what? I know that we're like asking for the tantrums, but I'm just gonna try doing this cold turkey. No Pepsi, no bottle. I'll just give him a glass of milk instead. And Merle can attest to the fact that it actually went really well. And by the end of the week, baby Michael, who had come in really emotionally volatile and upset and colicky, was a completely different kid. The Beans absolutely loved baby Michael. They said he was such a joy to have that they wanted to adopt him, and they began filing the paperwork. Meanwhile, Clarence was still in the picture. He had visitation rights as the biological father. So for 4 years, the Beans had to deal with Clarence. Baby Michael did not want to visit with Clarence, but they were obligated by the rules of the court to make sure that he did. They would try and talk to him about it. They would say, Michael, you know, he's your dad and we love you and we want to become your official parents and everything. But Right now, you still have to visit with him. It's just the rule. We'll get in trouble otherwise. I'm so sorry. And it said that he would sit under the piano stool and he would rock back and forth and he would just say, "That mean man, that mean man, that mean man," over and over and over again. He truly didn't want to go. Meanwhile, Clarence was appealing to the court system and actually going on the news as well. He was doing anything and everything to try and get Michael back. He made claims publicly on air that every single time that Michael stated that he wanted to visit with his father, that the Beans would then enact corporal punishment on Michael. Mind you, there was absolutely no evidence of this. This was just a random conjecture on his part, presumably to paint him in a better light because DHS had taken Michael from him on the grounds of child abuse and neglect. Clarence would appeal to the court saying, "I wasn't a neglectful father overall, but I was neglectful that week." The nurses and the doctors, they saw that baby Michael had a dirty diaper and stuff because I was just so overcome with the news of my tragically deceased wife. Who wouldn't be? So yes, I was neglectful, but I was only neglectful that one time, and I feel like I deserve a pass. But the circumstantial evidence would paint a very different picture. Every time that Michael would go over to his dad's house, he would come back incredibly upset. It wasn't just because it was a disruption of his routine, it was because he truly hated visiting with Clarence. But Clarence did not care. He did not stop appealing to the courts. It was at this point that DHS said, "Okay, fine, you know what, maybe we'll consider this, but first, we need a DNA test to prove paternity." Clarence clearly didn't see this coming. This was several years into this entire process, almost 4. And when he took that paternity test, the results came back proving that he was not Michael's biological father. And even though he was married to Tanya and Michael is Tanya's biological son, he had never officially adopted Michael and therefore had no parental claim. The courts immediately terminated his parental rights and he no longer had visitation. Directly after this, the Beans start noticing a weird truck seemingly casing their house. So Merle calls DHS and she says, "Hey, ever since Clarence lost his parental rights, there's been this truck, kind of slowly driving by our house, and it's kind of making us nervous. So I just wanted to call and ask, what truck does Clarence drive? And can you just give me a general description of what he looks like?" Because even though Clarence had visitation, the Beans had never actually seen him at this point. DHS gives Merle a description and she's like, "Okay, yeah, that's the exact car. That's what this guy looks like who keeps circling outside of our house." And DHS is like, I don't know, Merle. I feel like you might just be reading into this a little too much. I feel like you're just being paranoid. And Merle's like, "What? No, I literally see him right now." And they're like, "I know, but a lot of foster parents, they get nervous when things like this happen. They're worried that there's gonna be jilted parents who are gonna come for them. And it almost never happens." And Merle's like, "Okay, yeah, but I'm getting a really bad feeling about this and I'm telling you, it is the same truck and it is seemingly the guy." Then on September 12th, 1994, the cops receive a report of a man handcuffed to a tree with duct tape around his mouth. That man was a principal of the local elementary school, and the suspect in question had come into the elementary school. He had said that he was a father of one of the students, that he was here to pick up Michael, the suspect obviously being Clarence. And when the principal was like, "No, I know who Michael's foster father is, you're not Mr. Bean," Clarence flashes a gun and is like, "Listen, I'm prepared to die today. Unless you would like to die today, you're gonna get me Michael and you're gonna get me out of here. And if you do that, I'll let you live. But if you don't, I will kill you." At gunpoint, the principal is taken to Michael's classroom. He calls Michael out of the room. And then Clarence takes the principal and Michael out to the principal's car. He kidnaps him in his own car. He drives out into a remote area, into the woods, goes a little bit into the tree line, handcuffs this principal to the tree, duct tapes his mouth closed, and then leaves with Michael. Luckily for the principal, he was eventually discovered by a random passerby. Upon learning that a child has been kidnapped, The FBI is immediately contacted, and the next day, Special Agent Joe Fitzgerald shows up. There's not too many kidnappings in Oklahoma, but when there is a kidnapping in Oklahoma, Joe Fitzgerald was your man. And brief aside, just my personal opinion, from what I know of Joe Fitzgerald, dude is the GOAT. Love Joe. Love Joe. One of the unsung heroes of the FBI, I gotta say. Joe immediately gets to work because after the first 48 hours, your chances of finding a child significantly drop. Your chances of finding anybody who's gone missing drop, but with children, it's a little bit more of a delicate situation. Joe immediately puts out an all points bulletin, which is sort of like an Amber Alert in the 90s, you know, before we had those, where they basically just send like a poster with all of the relevant stats on the victim who is missing around to all of the local precincts. And then Joe immediately starts looking into Clarence's past. He sees that in the 90s, Clarence had tried to collect on his wife's insurance policy. And when he looked at the social security number that Clarence had used, it was connected to an identity that was not Clarence's. Instead, that social security number belonged to a man named Frank Floyd. Frank Floyd was a career criminal, and he had at least 5 different aliases in his lifetime that we know of. One of the first things that Joe noticed when he was looking into Frank was that he had been registered at a halfway house. If you're in a halfway house, it means you're coming out of prison. So obviously this guy had a rap sheet. So Joe pulls up his record. He sees 1962, abducted a girl who was just 4 years old. Frank was 19 at the time. 1963, robbed a bank at gunpoint. 1972, released into the custody of a halfway house. 1973, assaults a woman. In 1973, after he violently assaulted that woman, he was taken into custody, he paid his bail, but then he never showed up to trial, which makes him a fugitive. Frank had been a fugitive for 17 years at this point. Joe knows this is just the tip of the iceberg. Somebody who has successfully been a fugitive for almost 2 decades knows how to hide. This is going to complicate this situation even more. He reaches out with the FBI's behavioral team. They tell him, realistically, he's got about a week. They had a loose psychological profile on Frank at this time, and they deduced that based off of what they know of him, after a week, he's gonna start getting tired of Michael. He's gonna consider him a liability, and he's going to feel the need to get rid of him. And for someone like Frank, who has a lot of dark triad traits and a long-standing history of violence, getting rid of Michael is going to look like killing Michael. With this in mind, they maximize their efforts. Every news station is covering this story. They are blasting Michael's face all over the news. They're showing pictures of Tanya every once in a while, explaining that this is his biological mother, but she has since died as of 1990. They're showing pictures of Clarence, whose real name is Frank Floyd, saying that he is not the biological father, that he is the kidnapper, and everyone is seeing this. And that everyone includes Sharon Marshall's best friend from high school, Jenny, and her mother. Jenny's mother, like many mothers across America, had seen this story and was incredibly distressed, but also morbidly fascinated. She wanted the closure of knowing that Michael was safe and sound. And so when it came on the news, it immediately caught her attention. What she didn't expect, though, was to see Sharon. But they weren't calling her Sharon. They got her name wrong. How did every news station in the nation get her name wrong? They're all calling her Tanya. Her name's not Tanya. She calls her daughter and she's like, Jenny, put on the news. Your friend Sharon from high school, she's everywhere. Jenny's confused. She's like, oh, why? Is she being interviewed? You know, Jenny's picture of Sharon is still that she's this high achiever who's gonna do incredible things. And this is when Jenny's mom has to break the news to her that not only is her son Michael missing, but her friend Sharon died years ago in 1990. Jenny calls the FBI and she explains to them, hey, that woman that you're showing everywhere, that's not her name. Her name's not Tanya. Her name is Sharon. And all Jenny can think to herself is, what happened to my friend? I mean, last I saw her, she was gonna have her baby. Her dad was mad at her, sure, but I still thought she'd be okay. So let's get into it. What did happen to Sharon? After high school, even though Sharon had told Jenny that they were going to move to Arizona, which I think she thought was true at the time, they ended up moving to Tampa. Sharon is freshly 18 when her father tells her it's time for her to pay her dues. She needs to go out and she needs to get a job at the local strip club. The manager of the club attests to the fact that when Sharon walked in there, she looked like a kid, but she was technically legal. She clearly needed the money and she was beautiful, so she wasn't gonna turn her down. Sharon didn't really act like the other girls in the club. Not in terms of like an, I'm not like other girls, I'm better than this way, at all. She was different than the other girls in the club purely because she seemed really, really shy and uncomfortable, to be frank. While the other girls would eventually get used to the work environment and spend most of the day walking around naked, Sharon refused to ever be fully naked. She would always wear, at the very least, this sheer lace nightgown, so you could still see through, but she had something on her. She would also rarely talk to the other girls. She didn't feel comfortable sharing her life, where she was from, anything that was going on with her. But even still, despite the lack of information, it didn't take long for the other girls in the club to notice that Sharon's dad was weird. And actually, they started gossiping about it. Not in like a mean way about Sharon, but in like a beware of that guy kind of way. They were like, something's off with him. I don't know. I like Sharon, but I don't feel like I can be around her because I don't want to be around her dad. Her dad then tells her that she needs to go talk to the manager of the club and see how many stripper parties that she can get invited to, because they would have these parties that they would host outside of the club where you could go, sort of subsidize your income, and usually it was a pretty good deal. You would only have to dance for a short amount of time, but you would get paid a solid amount regardless. And there was this one party called the Millionaires Club Party where the girls would go, they would dance for about 20 minutes and they would make $500 to $1,000. So Sharon asks her manager if she can go. Her manager says yes. And not long into the party, one of the guests comes up to the manager and says, hey, you gotta get that girl Sharon out of here. The manager's surprised because people generally really like Sharon. And she's like, why? What happened? What's going on? The client explains she's standing outside the women's bathroom and she's offering for money. She's offering guys $50. The manager's upset. She goes and she confronts her and she's like, hey, we don't do that here. That's illegal. We can get in a lot of trouble doing that. And like, this is an extra curricular event for us. Like, you can't be doing things like that. It's gonna destroy our reputation. Sharon is really apologetic and she's like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. My dad told me that I should do this. Her manager's like, what? Your dad told you that you should sell yourself for $50? And Sharon's like, yeah, he even bought me the condoms. After hearing that, it's clear to her manager that like there is a lot going on in Sharon's life and she'd rather keep an eye on that than just fire her over this, because clearly it's a miscommunication and it wasn't her idea anyway. So she keeps Sharon on, and it's not long before she notices that Sharon is clearly pregnant. She never comes out and says as much, but it becomes obvious on its own. She's still allowed to keep her job though, and once she has baby Michael, she's an incredible mother. All of her coworkers at the club loved watching her interact with Michael. They were like, she was such a good mom. Like, you can tell how much they love each other. He's absolutely a mama's boy. It seems like this is genuinely the best thing that has ever happened to her. Sharon and Warren are living in a mobile trailer park nearby called the Golden Lantern Mobile Home Park. The way their house is set up is the back room, the only full room is Sharon's room. Her father, Warren, sleeps in the living room on a pullout, and Michael didn't really have a crib. It's at this time that Sharon becomes really close with this new girl, Cheryl. She's beautiful, she's Italian, she's a former beauty queen, and she sees the club as really just like a stepping stone to what she wants to accomplish next. Her dream is that she's gonna be in Playboy. She wants to be a icon. And because she was so beautiful, she was raking in the cash. She would drive a nice Corvette. She would pull up to the trailer park and she would say hi to everybody. Everyone loved Cheryl. She had sort of like the vibe of like the cool girl who's best friends with your older sibling, where you're just like, oh, I want to be like them someday. And if they give you any sort of acknowledgement, it just makes you feel really good, you know? She always had her nails done, her hair done, and she had like this loud energy about the way that she dressed, but she was actually like very naive and kind and gentle. Sharon had a babysitter come to the trailer park every single day to watch Michael. And it wasn't uncommon that Sharon, Cheryl, Warren, Michael, and the babysitter would all be hanging out together afterwards. The babysitter was about 15 years old, and she also lived in the trailer park. So one night, Warren's in the living room with the babysitter, and he goes to turn on wrestling for her. He has it saved on a VHS so that she can have something playing in the background while she's watching Michael. And when he puts in the VHS, a video starts playing of two women topless on the beach. The babysitter is confused about like what she's looking at. For a second, she probably thought it was like an ad or something that he had just recorded from the television. And then suddenly she realizes it. She goes, is that Sharon and Cheryl? Did he film his own daughter naked? Warren suddenly realizes his mistake and he turns it off immediately. The babysitter makes some excuse like, oh, sorry, like it's kind of late anyway, I should probably be getting home, because she's just so uncomfortable. This part I'm unclear on. The other girls at the strip club hear about this videotape. The manager of the strip club, who had sort of been trying to take Sharon under her wing, she approaches Cheryl and she's furious. She's like, what were you thinking? How could you do that? How could you put her in that kind of position? And Cheryl just says, oh, I'm sorry, Warren said that he was gonna take a video of me and he was gonna submit it to Playboy. He said, quote, you're gonna be famous. I didn't know I was doing something wrong. Because like I said, Cheryl was actually like a pretty naive girl. At that point, the manager is like, listen, I need you to stay away from Sharon and Warren. I cannot protect you. Something is clearly very wrong with that dynamic. You have got to stay out of there. I do not trust that man. Not long after, Warren starts calling the club all the time. And he's not asking for his daughter, he's asking for Cheryl. He's got some weird hyperfixation on her. He would call, is Cheryl in? No. Oh, okay. Do you know anything about Cheryl's dad? No, Warren. Okay. Well, do you know when Cheryl's going to be in? No, Warren. Okay. Well, do you know where like Cheryl's family is from? Warren, I'm getting off the phone. Everyone at the club tried to do anything and everything that they could to create a sense of distance between Cheryl and Warren, because they knew he clearly had some sort of weird hyperfixation on her, which happened from time to time in the club anyway, and they had a sort of unspoken protocol for how to handle it. Just make sure that the guys don't get confused and they don't forget that there are boundaries. But even still, one night, everyone hears screaming out in the parking lot. The manager runs outside to see what the commotion is, and it's Warren. He's yelling at Cheryl. Sharon is standing on the side trying to break it up, and he's in his truck screaming full-fledged. The manager hears him say to Cheryl, I'm gonna kill you. She intervenes, and she says, Warren, you've gotta get out of here. He does not care. He actually threatens to run her over, revs his car, and jerks it towards her. At that point, she takes Cheryl, she walks her to her car, and she makes Warren leave. And just a couple days later, Warren and Sharon would leave town with Michael. At this point in the story, you're probably thinking Sharon has the absolute worst luck, that she's grown up with this terrible father. She ends up in this atrocious marriage. She dies young at just 20 years old. And then her son, post-mortem, is kidnapped by her former husband. How could things get any worse? Things couldn't get any worse. Well, unfortunately they did. Because you see, when the news was reporting on Michael's disappearance and they were referring to Sharon as Tanya, that wasn't the only identity that Jenny had to correct. Most people watching this story unfold, when they saw Clarence's face on the news, all they saw was a career criminal. When Jenny saw Clarence's face on the news, she saw a familiar face. That wasn't Sharon's husband. That was her dad. No, there was no Clarence and there was no Warren. All there was Frank Floyd. And Frank Floyd was a convicted pedophile When Jenny met with Special Agent Joe Fitzgerald, she realized that when Sharon had been assaulted in front of her by who she had thought was Sharon's father, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Frank had not only been doing this to Sharon for years, but he'd been doing it to other people. And that's when Joe figured it out. He was looking over Frank's rap sheet. He was talking to Jenny about it. And Jenny kept saying, "I can't believe it. Sharon was only 20. She was only 20. She was only 20 when she died. I can't believe she was only 20 years old." And suddenly, she was only 20 years old. Frank Floyd cannot be her biological father. According to his rap sheet, he had been in jail not just when she was born, but he would have been in jail well before and well after her conception. It wasn't possible. And he already had a history of kidnapping children. This timeline made it abundantly clear that Frank Floyd must have also kidnapped Sharon, which means Sharon isn't just not Tanya, she's not Sharon either. Sharon is just the name that Frank had assigned to her. They don't know her real identity. At this point, Joe, who again, I love Joe, has a brilliant idea. He goes, okay, this guy has such clear patterns. He does the same thing over and over and over again. He does the same bad as many times as he can get away with. So I guarantee there's at least a chance that he's reusing aliases and he's revisiting old locations. And so he puts a stop on all aliases that they know are associated with Frank Floyd. So if he tries to register a license under any previous aliases, it'll get flagged. Not long after, in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the previous locations that Frank Floyd had already lived as a felon in, he applies for a new license under Warren Marshall, his previous alias. Joe instructs them, okay, let him think he's gonna get the license, all right? Tell him that he's all good to move forward. And then when he goes to get that license, we're gonna book him. And it works. They finally arrest Frank Floyd after a 17-year-long run. After they surround him and they take him into custody, they're like, okay, we gotta go to his apartment building. Michael's not in his apartment. All right, we gotta talk to the neighbors. Have they seen a little boy? Has anybody seen Michael? Does anybody know anything? He hadn't talked to any of his neighbors. He had just been in and out as quickly as possible. They didn't know anything. They didn't see any little boy. While Frank's in custody, they're asking him, where is Michael? Is Michael still alive? Frank insists that he's still alive. They're like, okay, well, where is he? Frank tells officers that Michael is with some anonymous rich people who are gonna take him to a foreign land and make sure that he's safe. I mean, it's obvious bull, yes, but just to double down on the fact that it's obvious, what rich people would Frank Floyd know? This guy is like the scum of the earth. I mean, there's plenty of scummy rich people, but I'm just saying, he's the scum of the earth and he exploits other people for all of his income. He does not have a job. At this point in the investigation, the Beans are absolutely heartbroken. When Frank was taken into custody, they thought, this is our chance. If Michael is still alive, this is the moment that we get him back and we can finally finish adopting him. And when they hear what Frank's saying, they know, they see the writing on the wall. It's not looking good. Joe Fitzgerald, he feels the same way, but it's a kid and you want to hope that you're wrong. You want to hope that like they're still out there somewhere until you have evidence that they're not. And beyond that, it's really, really hard to get a murder conviction without a body. You can, but it makes it a lot harder. Although there's a lot of evidence in this case pointing to the fact that Frank has clearly kidnapped Michael, most of the evidence around a potential murder, even though it seems to us very glaring, is circumstantial. And in the American court system, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Edward Kumiga and Mark Vancey are the assistant US attorneys put on this case. Their entire job is to try and get Frank Floyd locked up for good. They know that without Michael's body, and they're still searching for it, so this could turn around at any point in time, that it's unlikely that they're gonna get a conviction if they just go for the murder charge. So they decide to go for all of the charges that are a safe bet and try and get as many of them as possible to maximize his prison time, hopefully buying the defense time to find Michael's body while Frank Floyd is imprisoned. To charge him with kidnapping, carjacking, and 2 separate firearm offenses because he committed the carjacking with a firearm and he committed the kidnapping with a firearm. The kidnapping one is actually up to 25 years, kidnapping with a firearm. So that adds a lot to his sentencing. Oh my God, this is where Floyd gets so much more annoying. He does the classic narcissistic reaction to the court system, which is that he wants to talk. He wants to talk as much as possible. He just doesn't want to talk about bad things that he's done. He just goes full narc with it. So Floyd decides to move forward with hybrid representation. My dad's an attorney, so I called him to make sure that I got this right. Hybrid representation, as I understand it, is when you can self-represent for parts of the trial, but you still have an attorney there with you for the parts that you don't want to do. The benefit to something like this, I'm assuming this is what Frank got out of it, is you get a chance to tell your side of the story by basically making your plea to the judge without having to be limited to cross-examination. Because most people, they get to say their side when they're witnessing. And when you're witnessing, that means both sides of the court can ask you questions. Frank doesn't want to answer those questions though. So something like this benefits him because he can go up, he can argue at the judge, and he can tell his side of the story that way, and the opposition can't weigh in or direct him or ask any questions at that time. But like, before you think Frank is like smart for doing that, he's not. He does a terrible job. He goes on like a bunch of weird tangents that have nothing to do with anything. It's just all soaked in hubris. It makes him look so bad. It just makes him look just incredibly narcissistic and sociopathic, which, like, surprise, surprise, he's just completely oblivious to it. He's pulling like a total Ted Bundy, where he thinks he's being like ridiculously clever and charismatic, but really everybody is just looking at him like, you're the most insane person I've ever seen in my life, and this defense is terrible. So Jenny goes up. Obviously she's going to testify against who she knew as Warren. Now it's been revealed as Frank Floyd. And when she goes up, she said that, and I love Jenny for this, she said that she went up there to testify against him and she looked him in the eyes and she was just thinking to herself, I've got you. If you're watching this, you go, girl. A lot of times in situations like this, in hearings at least, sometimes there'll be a divider. So like victims or people who are really close to the victim don't have to like look at the person who did it. A lot of people don't want to. But Jenny, hell yeah, she wanted to. I respect it. I think that's really cool, Jenny. When Frank cross-examined her, he literally had the audacity to say to her, let me get this directly quoted. He said, "You drew your opinion about me after the FBI talked to you, correct?" Frank, whatever, okay. Jenny responds, "No, I drew my opinion on you after I saw the lingerie you bought your daughter." Hell yeah, Jenny. So they were successful on all counts, and he was charged with 52 years in prison. After this conviction, after he's taken away, locked up, Floyd is not happy. Anyone who tries to get a comment from him, he's just like, screw you. That's like the YouTube version. He's like, but as fate would have it, the principal whose car was jacked, his car is discovered. And the discovery of the principal's car was crucial. It was crucial. Even though Frank was already in prison, remember, they're still trying to convict him of murder. He's not a convicted murderer this time. He's just got another kidnapping charge under his belt. So when they find this car, they find the jackpot of incriminating evidence against Frank. They don't find a body, but what they do find is photographs. Frank had taken a manila folder and duct taped it to the bottom of this principal's car after he had abandoned the car. These photos were almost all pornographic in nature. There was CP present, as well as adult vor, but what was most damning of all which pointed to the fact that these photos were clearly Floyd's, is that they were pornographic photos of Sharon as a child. In addition to that, the smoking gun, you could say, of these photos was this one photo of this one Jane Doe. Again, after this, you should watch the documentary. It's really good, really thorough. All the people mentioned are present in the documentary and they do a really great job. The Jane Doe in question is beaten so badly that Joe Fitzgerald, just upon seeing the photo, is like, these injuries are so severe that no person could survive this. She was clearly murdered, because even if she was alive at the time of these photos being taken, there's no way that she lived long after this. It's just too severe. And Joe notices another key detail about this Jane Doe. Amidst all the gore, all the distraction of just like these horrifying photos, he notices that she has tan lines. So he deduces that it's possible, maybe even likely, that if these are Frank Floyd's photos, which clearly they are, this Jane Doe was in one of the places that he lived that was warm. Because he lived in places like Florida and Arizona. So he sent out these Jane Doe photos to departments in every warm weather state that Frank Floyd had inhabited in the last 20 years. It's an absolute shot in the dark, but Joe really wants to get this guy and he's gonna do everything that he has to do that. March 29th, 1995. Let's jump back in time for a second. Highway Patrol comes across a body of a woman who has been badly decomposed. It's clearly a homicide, but because she's a Jane Doe, the case ends up being cold. They have no idea who she is. Just 1 year later, Joe Fitzgerald would send out this John Doe photograph, and because her t-shirt in the photo is the same as the t-shirt that Highway Patrol found wrapped around her neck when they discovered her body, that lets them know this is our Jane Doe. This results in her being identified as Cheryl Ann Camesso, Sharon's co-worker from the strip club in Florida, the one that Warren, aka Frank Floyd, had gotten into a huge fight with in the parking lot. The one where he had yelled, "I'm gonna kill you," and then she was never seen again, and he skipped town just 3 days later. That Cheryl. It's important to note that after the manager confronted Cheryl about the beach footage, about the topless beach footage that Warren had took, one of the things that she had told her was that Warren had tried to have sex with her and she had rebuffed his advances and he had gotten really aggressive about it. That is the believed motive for why he became hyperfixated on her and would eventually kill her. She had been missing at this point for 6 years. People thought that Warren and Sharon had just left town because people were gossiping too much about their weird father-daughter relationship, and Warren didn't like all of the attention, people noticing all of his idiosyncrasies and him becoming increasingly unpopular, and the club not liking his presence and trying to create some distance and maybe even separate him from his daughter. That wasn't really the whole truth. I'm sure that contributed to why it was beneficial for them to skip town, but it was really because he had killed Cheryl. And that babysitter, the one who had seen that footage, who lived in the same trailer park, she attested to the fact that just days after Michael and Warren and Sharon had left town, a man went into their trailer as if it was nothing, clearly doors unlocked, walked around for a while, came outside, lit a cigarette, flicked it, and then the entire trailer went ablaze. Actually, that's an understatement. It completely blew up. The babysitter said that she saw it from across the street and the stove just was so explosive that it was clearly arson. And it's at this point that Frank Floyd marries his kidnapped daughter because he knows that the police are probably looking for Cheryl's murderer, and that because he had had this huge explosive fight with her in the parking lot and because his trailer had just blown up and he had just skipped town right afterwards, he was probably going to be a suspect. And so he made Sharon marry him because police on paper were looking for a father, a daughter, and a grandchild. But what they weren't looking for was a married couple with a baby. So they changed their names. They're no longer father and daughter on paperwork because of the alias, and they get married. So naturally, Frank is tried for the first-degree murder of Cheryl, and he's facing lethal injection. So fast forward to 2002. Frank is on death row. Meanwhile, an author by the name of Matt Bierbeck sees a picture of Sharon when she was just a child sitting on Frank's lap. One of his friends sends it to him from the Doe network, explaining she's a kidnapped child. Here's the whole context. Look how haunting this photo is now that we know. And the photo of Sharon, I'll show it, really is haunting. The forensic psychologists say that she has a classic look of an abused child, where she's not smiling in the photo and she's staring off into space, even though she's like on her parents' lap. And Matt is immediately interested. He starts looking into it. The more he learns about Sharon, the more he's like, wow, she's just sort of a classic damsel in distress. She's this girl who, despite everything, despite the fact that the world has been so ugly to her, is so kind. Despite the fact that her world was so ugly, that empathy and kindness and joy were never modeled for her in her home life. She's this person of great emotional intelligence who's beloved by everyone and is excelling in school and doing all of these amazing things. And if she had just had the chance to escape Frank, she likely would have been an incredible story of survival and perseverance. He describes her as, quote, this beautiful young woman trapped in evil. And he knows that Frank is the only one who knows who Sharon actually is, because he's the one who kidnapped her, so he's got to know her original name. Or at the very least, he knows where he got her from, and he knows enough information that we could find out. Matt, being an investigative journalist, decides, I'm gonna make my next book about this. I'm gonna talk about how Sharon did all these incredible things and what an incredible student she was, despite everything, but I want to know her name. I want to know who she is. And because Frank's the only one who knows, I gotta go talk to Frank. Like I said, Frank is a classic narcissist, and so the second that Matt gets there and tells him that he's writing a book about him, Frank is elated to tell him everything about himself. And because of that, we have a lot of background information on Frank, why he is the way he is, and how it all happened. So here's what we know. Frank was born in 1943. He had a couple of siblings, but his father died when he was still young. His mother was unable to take care of him and his siblings, and so she surrendered them, giving him up to the Georgia Baptist Home for Boys. While he was there, he experienced extreme corporal punishment. He testifies that his hands and feet were beaten until they were swollen, and he had hot water poured on him, and all of these truly atrocious things that would certainly cause some serious social and developmental delays in a child. He claims that he was R-worded by other boys in the home, that because he was smaller, they would often stick things inside of him like fingers and other body parts and just get away with it. And he said when he finally got out, he joined the military. Whenever Matt would try and focus on a specific crime, like, okay, so you joined the military, was that before or after the kidnapping of the 4-year-old girl when you were 19? And Frank would always be like, alleged, I didn't do that. He would deny. Matt would be like, okay, well, let's move on. Where did you get Sharon? And Frank would go, I didn't get her, she just came with me. And Matt would be like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Came with you where? From where? To where? And Frank would be like, I don't want to talk about that. So he was all down to chit chat when it came to things that painted him in a victim context, which I'm not implying that he wasn't actually a victim of those things. I think he's being honest about what he faced in his childhood. In fact, I think that's probably a lot of what has potentially shaped him. Though there is this myth that every single person who is abused becomes an abuser. That's definitely not true. But people who are abusers sometimes do have a childhood history of being abused. But I do just want to make it clear that the cycle of abuse is often misinterpreted, and if every single person who is a victim of abuse became an abuser after like 2 generations, every single person would be an absolute psycho. Frank denied all murders. He denied the murder of Cheryl, denied the murder of Sharon, denied the murder of Michael, but he was comfortable with discussing Sharon as long as it wasn't related to any of his crimes. He would say things like, and I quote, "She was kind, she was smart, and she loved me no matter what." I think that's Frank's interpretation of things, but Matt was getting increasingly fed up with this because after hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of interviewing Frank, he hadn't gotten any closer to Frank revealing Sharon's true identity, which was all he really wanted for the conclusion of his book. He wanted to be able to give everyone the closure of knowing who she actually was. But when it became clear that that was just not gonna happen, he realized he just needed to move forward with the publishing of his book. And hopefully putting this book out would put some pressure on Frank and investigators in general to figure out who Sharon really was, and maybe they'll be able to ID her because of that. When he releases his book, A Beautiful Child, it doesn't include her true identity, but it focuses more on how she was able to exceed in school and socially despite everything. But Matt's hopes would be answered, at least in a way, because after the book came out, everybody wanted to know who she really was. He started getting letters and letters and emails of people being like, but who was she really? How can you not tell us? And he would just respond and be like, well, I'm hoping someone can find out. That's I want to know too. 2005, there was a big break in the case. Matt received an anonymous email. And in that email, it said, would the DNA of Sharon's child help you with the case? Would it help you identify her? That email would be sent by Megan DeFriesney, who was in fact Sharon's biological child. You see, Sharon had put her up for adoption. I know what you might be thinking, oh, is this the baby from high school? I had thought that that was baby Michael. It's not baby Michael either. Sharon had had 3 pregnancies that we're aware of. She had had the high school baby who was allegedly put up for adoption. We don't know who or where that baby is as of right now. She had had Michael. Then she had had Megan, and Megan was also put up for adoption. Because you see, in 1989, Tanya, as she was known at the time, and Clarence, as he was known at the time, went to an adoption agency in New Orleans. Apparently Clarence was really dominating this adoption interview, saying that they couldn't afford the baby, and it did actually have a lot of red flags because the adoption agent wasn't sure how comfortable Tanya was with putting this baby up for adoption, but she seemed to still want to go forward with it enough that she just let them do it. And after Tanya had given birth, the adoption agent had a moment alone with her and she said, do you want to hold your baby before you don't see her again? And Tanya said, no, I don't. It would be too hard. I can't see her. And that was it. Megan was put up for adoption. And then all this time later in 2005, Megan's aunt would read Matt's book and she would call her sister and say, hey, you know how we saw that Megan's bio mother had died? There's so much more to it. I think you're gonna have to tell Megan. Megan was aware that she was adopted and she was aware that her bio mom had died, but she was not aware of just what a dark situation her biological mother had been living through. Because Megan had volunteered her DNA, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the NCMEC, was able to get involved. They put Ashley Rodriguez on the case and she got the FBI involved because you might be thinking, wasn't the FBI already involved? The FBI was only involved in the case of Michael. The FBI was not involved in terms of Sharon. That case, even though they suspected foul play, was a peripheral element in Michael's case. It wasn't its own designated case. At this point, Joe Fitzgerald had retired from the FBI and he had had an incredibly successful career. The vast majority, almost all of the cases that he was on were solved. Every single case that went to trial, he got the outcome that he wanted, but he said that he still had 2 nagging questions after his career was over that he wanted answers to. What was Sharon's real name? And where is Michael's body? He was helpful on a volunteer basis for the rest of this. As you can see, I just stand Joe. I really do. So they got 2 FBI agents on the case, one of which went by the name of Nate Furr. So they went in on Ashley Rodriguez's request to go speak with Frank again. When they stepped foot in the room, Frank immediately started talking. They didn't even have to ask him to. They actually hadn't even sat down. For 45 minutes straight, they were just standing there while Frank was ranting and raving into the void. And it took them that long to even get a word in, at which point they were like, Frank, you seem to think we're your attorneys. We're not your attorneys. We're from the FBI. And Frank was like, oh, what do you want? We're here for Michael's case, but we're also here to inquire about Sharon. We want to open that back up. And he was like, I would appreciate if you didn't. I'm sure you would, Frank, but like, what? Despite the fact that questioning Frank about this had never worked out in the past, they were hoping that because he was on death row and he was getting closer and closer to his lethal injection date, he might have some desperation. He might think that if he volunteers more information, it could help with his case, maybe get him off death row, or at the very least buy him some more time. They start asking him questions and he's not being very responsive, at least not in the way that they want. One of the agents stands up and he starts yelling, "How did you kill him?" Frank doesn't like this. He's like, "Don't do that." He keeps going. He keeps yelling, "How did you kill him?" And he's smacking his hands on the table. So he's going, "How did you kill him? How did you kill him? How did you kill him?" over and over and over again. And then suddenly Frank blurts out, "I shot him in the back of the head 2 times to make it quick." It actually worked. The agents go on. They're like, "Okay, well, where's his body?" And he says, "I buried him somewhere around the Oklahoma-Texas border." Search parties go out and thoroughly check the entire border, and they never find any sign of Michael. It's not clear if they didn't find his remains because something happened to them or if it's because Frank was just outright lying. But they continue to talk to Frank because they still want to know Sharon's true identity. And then Frank starts bragging about how he was a really hot bus driver when he was younger, which is so strange. And the agents are just kind of like, "Oh, okay, Frank, what does this have to do with anything?" And he was like, "It has a lot to do with everything." So he goes on talking about how he was a really handsome bus driver, how he looked so good, and he was the most handsome bus driver out of all the bus drivers of the time. They're just kind of like, all right, listening to this, not sure where this is going. He says that he was driving in Charlottesville, North Carolina, and that's when he met Sandy. They're thinking, is Sharon Sandy? Who's Sandy? One of the investigators asks a crucial question. He says, "All right, what was your name at this point in time?" And we learn of a brand new alias that up until this point, we were ignorant to. Frank Floyd says that at that time, he went by the name of Brandon Cleo Williams. He went on about his marriage to Sandy, how happy they were, how the kids were, where they were born, what they were like, that she had 3 daughters from previous relationships. And he starts talking about the oldest daughter, and they're like, "Okay, well, where was she born?" He says she was born in Michigan. They say, "How do you know that?" And he says, "I saw the birth certificate." And they go, "Okay, well, again, like, Frank, how is this relevant?" And Frank goes, "Because that's the girl. That's the girl you're here to inquire about. That's Sharon." And they said, "That's Sharon. Okay, well, what's Sharon's real name?" And he finally says, Sharon's real name is Suzanne Savakis, and her parents were Sandra and Clifford Savakis. Oh, and by the way, they're both still alive today. Sandra and Clifford were high school sweethearts, and they got married right after high school, and just a couple months after they got married, Sandra got pregnant. But then Clifford went off to Vietnam. While Clifford was in Vietnam, Sandra had Susie. And it wouldn't be until 6 months later that Clifford could come home and see his infant daughter for the first time. Even though Susie was a very happy and easy baby by all accounts, it was still a lot of pressure for Sandra, who was just freshly an adult, to be basically a single mom raising her child all alone. And so while Clifford was in Vietnam, Sandra got a boyfriend. And when Clifford finally came home, Sandra asked for a divorce. At that point, she had 2 more daughters, Allison and Amy, from her new relationship, and then she moved into a trailer park. And unfortunately, the trailer park was later hit by a tornado that flipped the entire trailer. And this gave Sandra such bad PTSD that she was really struggling to be a mother to her 3 daughters. She said that there were times where she was just sitting on the ground staring out into space, and she could hear her daughters yelling for her, and she just couldn't bring herself to do anything to care for them. So she took them to Child Protective Services because she thought that's who you talk to when you need help. She didn't realize that they were just going to fully take her children from her. After they took them, the civil servant who was working the case could tell that clearly Sandra didn't expect that to happen. She didn't have a full understanding of what was going on. She said, "Why don't you just, go to church, work on yourself, and I'm sure you'll be able to get your kids back." And that's exactly what Sandy did. She started volunteering at the local church to try and get herself rehabilitated and get herself in tip-top shape to be an active parent again. And while she was at church, she met Frank, unfortunately, who again she believed to be Brandon. Frank love bombed her immediately. He was like, don't worry, you know what? We know each other now. We can be together, we can get married, and we'll get your girls back. And Sandra, that was exactly what you wanted to hear. So she believed him, and that's exactly what they did. They got married right away. They got her kids back, and then she realized that he was incredibly abusive, and she was trapped in this situation with him. She was trying to figure out what to do, and she hadn't figured out a solution yet when one fateful day she went to 7-Eleven to buy the girls diapers, and she was running low on cash, so she used a bad check. She got caught and she was put in jail for 30 days. While she was in jail, Frank knew that that was his opportunity, and that's when he stole her children. By the time that she got out, her girls were gone. He had simply taken them. When Sandra went to the police to report this, the cops told her, you're legally married, so this isn't a criminal situation, this is a civil situation. You've got to figure it out with them. And while she was trying to figure out how to combat this situation, Frank was still making moves. He took Amy and Allison and he dropped them off at an orphanage, leaving just him and Susie on the run. And even though Susie, formerly known as Tanya, formerly known as Sharon, died in 1990, it wasn't until 2017 that her real name could be put on her actual tombstone. Clifford had had the opportunity briefly after the children were taken by CPS to take Susie back into his care, but they didn't want to separate her from her other two siblings who weren't Clifford's daughters. And he had just got back from Vietnam and he was suffering from severe PTSD, so he wasn't even sure that he could handle one child, let alone three. And because they were unwilling to separate the girls, they gave him the option. You either get all three of them or you get none of them. And to this day, that's something that Clifford truly regrets. He wishes that he had made a different decision. And Clifford can be quoted to say, "I can't talk to Suzanne, but I can talk to Megan. That'll do." While all of this was unfolding, Megan actually had her first child, who was a boy, and she chose to name him Michael. Oh, jeez. Really heavy story, you know? I mean, Spooky Saturdays, they're heavy. True crime is heavy. But so much of this story, I can't help but think of Lolita. In Lolita, a very similar chain of events happen, except it's fictional, where Humbert, the main character, you could say, he marries this woman with the goal of getting to her daughter, Lolita, because he's a pedo. The mother, he's trying to figure out ways to dispose of her so it can just be him and Lolita, and eventually she dies. And at that point forward, he goes on the run with Lolita, constantly changing his identities, putting her in school, and grooming her into adulthood. All the while, he's assaulting her. And his plan is that when she's an adult, they can have a child together, and that child can be Lolita 2.0. And then maybe if he gets lucky, he can even do the same thing with his grandchild. And it's just like this really disturbing, sadistic thought pattern. And the book does a really good job of demonstrating it to you. It's just, everything about this story, it's just really feels like a real life Lolita to me. It's just so similar, and it's just so horrifying. It's just so sad. I just feel so intensely for everybody who's involved. And I also just want to put it out there, Megan, her father, like her paternity, we don't know for sure who her dad is. A lot of people speculate that it is likely Frank, but I think that Megan could find out that information if she wanted to, and either she has found it out and doesn't want to talk about it, or she doesn't want to know. So I just want to say that I think that we should respect that boundary, because it seems like this entire family and friends network, anybody who's involved in this situation, has been through enough. You know? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think. This is just like a super intense story, and again, you should watch the documentary Girl in the Picture on Netflix, because it is incredibly thorough, and I was just shocked the entire time that I was watching it. But I'll see you guys on Monday for Mukbang Monday, and I'll see you next Saturday for another Spooky Saturday. Bye!